Hello and welcome to this Connecting Europe webinar. I'm Sophie Pornschlegel. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with the European Policy Center and Project Lead of Connecting Europe. Today we're going to speak about the German Zeitenwende, so the change of era in security and defense policy. I will say a few words about Connecting Europe beforehand so you know what it is. It is a project that is led by the European Policy Center together with Stiftung Mercator, a German foundation. And the idea is to connect civil society with EU decision makers and also have a greater exchange between EU member states and Brussels. And so we decided to discuss today Germany's security and defense policy, as there was a big speech of Olaf Scholz a few days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where he explained that there would be a change of an era, a watershed moment where Germany would change its approach towards security and defense policy. I won't get too much into details. I think the most important is to know that they would finally reach the 2% GDP target of NATO, that they would have 100 billion extra fund for the German army, and that they would also probably deliver heavy weapons to war zones, which is quite a change from the previous approach that Germany had. I have to say that this big Zeitenwende had quite a bumpy start. There have been controversial discussions within Germany, and European partners have been waiting for Germany to make up its mind. It's quite a process, I would say. And we're here to discuss it today with two wonderful speakers. I'm very happy to have them both here. The first one is Jana, who is the head of the ECFR office in Berlin. And the other one is Patricia, who is integrated researcher at the Portuguese Institute of International Relations and advisor at the National Defense Institute. A few housekeeping rules. You probably know online events by now, but we will have some time for questions, so don't hesitate to ask your questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand later on. I hope this will be an interactive discussion, so think of questions you have to ask and go ahead. So I'll start with you, Jana. What has happened since Scholz's speech on 27th of February? Is this really a watershed moment, or was this more of a communications exercise? Maybe if you can tell us a little bit where we stand at the moment.
Thank you very much, Sophie. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with the EPC again. I'm a fan, and yeah, so it's nice that we can collaborate on this one. Maybe before we start to talk about what has happened since Olaf Scholz gave the speech, I want to make some points to put the speech into context, and because I think they are important. First of all, it is not that Olaf Scholz's original plan was to turn German foreign policy, German security and defense policy, German Russia policy upside down. The original plan and idea, I think, during the campaign, but also when he came into office, was very much to basically be a Merkel in a suit. So it was very much about continuity. I think Olaf Scholz, by and large, was very sympathetic towards Germany's foreign policy under the Merkel years, on Russia, on China, on security and defense. So it was not that there was a big willingness actually to wage a revolution. And when Olaf Scholz talked about Zeitenwende, he said that the Russian war of aggression marks a turning point in European history. So the Zeitenwende is less basically the German answer. It's more a historical fact, and we need to react to it. So it's a disruptive change coming from the outside, and Germany needs to react rather than Germany having had an ambitious and very much laid out plan already in the beginning. And I think that's important. And the other thing that I think is important is, if you read the speech now, please keep in mind that the speech was made 3 days after the war started. Observers, at least all the observers I know, including myself, were still assuming that this would lead to a quick victory for Russia. So it was not, as I said, about announcing a long-term plan or also about a long-term support plan for Ukraine. It was more a first quick reaction to a scenario where Russia would possibly take over Ukraine, where we would be where kind of Ukraine's western border would be the border with Russia, or something like that as a scenario. And it was basically, I think, the attempt to justify the 100 billion euro on defense to get Germany on track when it comes to territorial defense, because the very moment the war broke out, the chief of the German army basically went public with a declaration where he said, well, the German military is basically naked, or he said, I don't know what the exact term was. I think in German he said, wir sind blank. So yeah, we don't have anything to offer. And so Zeitenwende, I think in the very beginning was not a thought through concept. And I'm not even sure if the government was aware of the expectations that it would create in Germany, but especially also outside Germany. It was born in a moment of shock, but of course, it is more than a moment of shock, because I think the assessment is pretty right. It's a epochal change that did not start with the war. I think for me, the war only accelerated the trends that were already there. But now Germany basically, or the government, needs to take the term Zeitenwende and needs to fill it with life. And that will not be easy, because in the initial days, kind of the war of aggression that Putin had declared led, I think, to a moment of clarity, but also of unity in Germany. So the historic speech and everything that Scholz announced was met with broad consensus in the Bundestag. The CDU MPs applauded wholeheartedly. I think one of them was even shouting bravo, and they were standing on their feet, actually. And they supported all the things that were announced: arms deliveries to Ukraine, far-reaching sanctions against Russia, the kind of the push to strengthen NATO's eastern flank, this special 100 billion fund for the Bundeswehr, anchored in German basic law, to spend 2% on defense, and to revise our energy dependence on Russia. And now, after basically the initial applause that Scholz got, now we are in the nitty-gritty details, and you see cracks emerging on two fronts. And maybe I do the two fronts and then I end it, not to make it a seminar here, but so the first crack that I see is emerging is on the consensus. Be it within the coalition government, be it within German society, be it also when it comes to unity with the opposition. So I think it's actually a huge task now for the future to keep the SPD left-wing voter base and party members on board, to keep the coalition functioning, and to have, basically the broader German public supporting what I think is just the beginning of a long-term process, if it's done properly. So, and when it comes to the Sondervermögen as such, you see that already party politics has taken over. Not so much in the coalition, I think, but very much when it comes to the opposition. So government and opposition is fighting about how to implement it now. The opposition, the CDU, is needed, CDU-CSU, in order to anchor the special fund in the German Grundgesetz. And so now it's really about how to do it best. And that is I think the actual debate has just been discussed in Parliament. I think the core of the matter is that when Scholz gave the speech, he said, from now on, we'll spend 2% on defense. And then one sentence later, he announced this Sondervermögen. And some observers thought it's both. It's 2% and the Sondervermögen. Now it turns out that the plan might be that the Sondervermögen is only kind of a 4-year budget, and that we will freeze our regular defense budget at about 50 billion euro. In order to spend 2%, we need to reach 75 billion euro. And so the idea is that the Sondervermögen will use successively over the next couple of years so that we reach 2%. And that leaves us with the big problem that once the money is empty, the special money, so we are stuck where we we are now. And so that's what the CDU doesn't want to support. They think they want something more sustainable, and they want to make sure that it's all about strengthening the Bundeswehr, strengthening the armed forces only, whereas some parts, especially of the Green Party, have argued that security is much more than only kind of military security, and one needs to spend the money also on other things that are related to security. And this is the debate. I think the Greens are on board, but one needs to find an agreement with the opposition. And just last word. So for me, Zeitenwende so far is the speech, everything that was declared, that is a revolution seen from a German perspective, but that you can also see as Germany is just catching up with reality, is fulfilling the promises that it had made a long time, is basically now providing the money to fulfill these promises, whereas it is not yet a long-term strategic plan how to make German foreign security and defense policy fit for the new era that is ahead of us.
Thanks so much, Jana. That's a very comprehensive overview already. And I think you portrayed really nicely that there are cracks showing once you propose something. There's different interpretations on how to explain it. You explain it's more of a historical moment, and then, you promise something, and then you have party politics catching up. And also very interesting to see that depending on the perspective you take, it might be more of a catching up than actually a very ambitious long-term plan. But up to you, Patricia. You're in Portugal. And now that Germany has been very busy with internal debates, I would be really interested in knowing, how did you assess it from a more external perspective? What was the reaction of other member states? How was it seen even in Portugal? And would you agree with what Jana said, that it's not that much of an ambitious long-term plan in the end?
Not yet.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I would also like to thank the EPC for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here to discuss this here today with Jana and the broader audience, and to respond to your question, how did we react in Portugal, or how sort of to assess an external reaction. I would say that in general, the Zeitenwende speech by Olaf Scholz was well received and had been long time in waiting, so to say, if we look at what the Zeitenwende speech meant, namely, I would say two things. One, this announcement that Germany would finally step up in its security and defense policy, especially in its defense policy, with the attainment of the 2%, as Scholz said it on the 27th, already by this year, so as to comply with NATO Wales Summit defense pledge clause. And also to institute to create a special fund of $100 billion on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the recognition by Germany that the broader interpretation of what this watershed moment in the history of Europe meant, as Scholz called it, that it meant really the collapse of the European order as we knew it after the end of the Cold War. And this post-Cold War order, of course, had been extremely beneficial to Germany. And I would say Germany has been one of the, in Europe, has been one of the greatest beneficiaries of this post-Cold War era. Why, or order? Why? Because the order meant that Germany was unified, but not only that, it also meant that NATO and the European Union would be enlarged. And this enlargement meant that Germany would be and was at the center of the European continent, well embedded in these two institutions, and having enlarged them to the eastern part of the continent meant that Germany worked well with the status quo. So it was a status quo power, as I have often described it, and it felt no need to change. And this picks up Jana's point that Scholz, when he campaigned, he already was sort of this Merkel in a suit, and he never denied this foreign policy continuity. So this was what was to be expected in November, December, and we saw this reluctance also by the German new government to engage with the idea of sanctions, to engage with the idea of weapons delivery to a zone of conflict, to and suspend Nord Stream 2. It was done a day or two before the aggression broke out, but there was this reluctance and this hesitancy. And I guess that's why when Scholz made the announcement on the Sunday morning in a special session in the Bundestag, it came as a big surprise, but it was very well received in general, and it was well received, as I say, for these two reasons. One, the recognition in general, not only of the Germans, but obviously of all Europeans, that with Russia's aggression on Ukraine, the European order had collapsed. And so there was no possibility of returning to the status quo ante. And then secondly, this idea that it had been a long time in waiting. So as to say, the Munich Consensus 2014, before a month or so before the annexation of Crimea, where Steinmeier, Gauck, and von der Leyen had announced that Germany should step up and acquire this responsibility in foreign and security policy. This was seen, well, finally Germany is there. And now the jury, of course, is still out, and we are observing it from the outside as well, because the announcements were very big, and Jana has mentioned them: the arms delivery to Ukraine, the application of sanctions, the end of Germany's energy dependence, the construction of LNG, liquefied natural gas sites in Germany, and the 2% plus the special fund. So this was all well received, but of course the question marks came up shortly afterwards to say, what about the implementation? On the one hand, will there be the political will and the political consensus and support, in this case by the CDU-CSU, as Jana has mentioned, and as far as I know, who have already said, the CDU, that the 100 billion would not be enough. And so that's one point also to bear in mind. So as to say, will there be enough political will on the one hand by the government and the political elite? And then, of course, secondly, whether Germany's public opinion is on board or not. And we've seen this recently with this letter by the intellectuals, by Alice Schwarz, Jürgen Habermas, Dieter Nuhr, arguing against arms delivery to Ukraine. And then another group led, or where Marie-Louise Beck from the Greens is involved, arguing for the need to proceed with heavy armaments delivery to Ukraine, precisely to how Scholz put it, to avoid that Russia wins and Ukraine, in fact, loses. So just to wrap up in terms of what I said, the way I personally look at the Zeitenwende speech is that there are two important points. One, the one we've just talked about, the change in Germany's defense policy and this bigger engagement also with territorial defense, strengthening of NATO's Eastern Pillar. That's one part of it, a really important part. Another part, a second element of the Zeitenwende speech, the way I look at it, and of course it's interlinked with the first, but it's still something different, which is Germany's bilateral relationship with Russia. I think this is a different point. And it also goes, again, it also represents a change in Germany's traditional Ostpolitik, the Wandel durch Handel, and the recognition that this decade-long mantra, especially of the SPD, that there can be no security order in Europe without Russia, that this no longer is valid as long as Putin as the president of Russia. I think this also represents a big change. And in this sense, there are two elements where the political will needs to be there. And I think it's not clear yet, although Lars Klingbeil has said a few days ago that the SPD needs a new direction, and specifically mentioned this formula of the inclusion / exclusion or non-participation of Russia in this new European order on the one hand, and on the other, as I said, this element of making sure that the German public is on board, that the German public understands that the collapse of the old order means that Germany and all European states, but also Germany, is not really no longer safe, and that we have no guarantee that Russia sort of, once this situation is over, that Russia sort of steps back.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patricia. I put in a few words in German for those who are not German speaking. We're sorry, it's a very German centric discussion today. Also, Lars Klingbeil being the head of the Social Democrats, knowing that you have the Greens, the Liberals, and the Social Democrats in a coalition, which also is an interesting part because I think the Social Democrats and the Greens, for instance, have very different approaches to defense. I'd like to come back to one of the points that you mentioned, Patricia, which is public opinion and also the political will. And maybe looking at you, Jana, I know that looking at surveys, there was support for a changed defense and security policy in Germany, but do you think that, the Merkel method was always to kind of wait it out and wait for public opinion to switch? Do you think that Scholz will use that moment, or do we have other issues now to really change this Zeitenwende speech into a real political agenda where you have a long-term strategy?
So first of all, I think the initial support for the speech was really striking and went way beyond the Bundestag, but really also applied to the German public. So, and you saw a sea change there if you compared opinion polls from basically before the war started to afterwards. So that I think here in Germany, for the first time in my adult lifetime, Germans feel threatened. And I see that especially with younger colleagues of mine or friends who also have no memory of the late Cold War. And this led to, I think a change of opinion in Germany, a drastic change, that people suddenly realized, kind of war is not something that happens in kind of faraway places in the Middle East or in Africa, but it's something that happens very nearby, 2 flight hours from Berlin, and then there is a nuclear threat, and maybe this conflict could escalate. It led then later, or kind of more recently, also to a lot of fear, I think, in the German population. But the first reaction was really, what, our Bundeswehr is really not functioning? This is a scandal, we need to change this. So I think, and I think it is still overall a very positive mood here towards this idea for Germany to invest more in its own defense. So there is, I think, a momentum that can be grasped. Where German public lately shifted a bit was when it came to the support of sending heavy weapons to Ukraine. There was a majority of Germans also supporting this initially, but then this changed, and now we have a basically 50-50 situation. Also caused, I think, by the open letter that you have just addressed. Also, I think not to blame the government for fear-mongering, but our Chancellor has been very outspoken when it came to the risks of escalation, a Third World War nuclear escalation, and has highlighted his concerns in this regard quite often. So, it's... But I think with some leadership, I think the German population up until now is really ready to support a lot of changes. But that is my criticism also when it comes to how the current government manages the Zeitenwende. I think I have written a critical article, maybe it was too early to declare basically that this was just one speech and that the government declared mission accomplished and now that's it. I think there is this ambition to go further, but still I think it had a lot of this sentiment that now we have the speech and now we have this groundbreaking decisions, which from an SPD perspective are really dramatic and really kind of putting German security and defense policy, Russia policy upside down. But from my perspective, as I said, this was a starting point for a broader debate and not only focused on security and defense. I think what the the debate here, and what I've heard also not only from experts or the media landscape, but also from people in the street, was really that everybody was surprised how bad the communication was. So that in the German public, I think a lot of confusion was created because people were told we cannot send heavy weapons to Ukraine because we would need to train the Ukrainian soldiers. That would take too long. And now we are sending one of the most complex weapon systems to Ukraine, the Gepard. It takes actually 5 months normally to train a soldier to operate the system. So, and then, yeah, the explanation why we couldn't do it changed constantly. And so I think that also created some confusion within the German public. And then I think also this sentiment that Germany is basically, following other countries and only basically jumping on the train at the very last moment when it has no other opportunity. So what I'm lacking a bit is kind of, when Scholz gave the speech, there was a lot of positive energy, a lot of ambition, a lot of hands-on, we can do this. And the follow-up process was less decisively when it came to arms deliveries, where I can understand that it's difficult for Germany, but also when it came to further sanctions. And so I think Germany's self-declared mission here is to be somewhere in the middle of the road compared to other European countries. And I think this is not Germany's natural position. I expect more from my country when it comes to leadership and spearheading movements.
That was a perfect transition, Jana, to my next question, which is for you, Patricia, about German leadership. I mean, I asked the question before on how other Europeans might have assessed what Germany is doing. What I would like to ask, and also knowing that we would like to look also at European defense and security policy, is do you think that this hopefully changed approach of Germany will have also more impact on EU defense and security policy? I mean, there was a strategic compass that was decided during the French Council presidency. We know France is really trying to move this topic forward. Do you think that, and I know it's not only France and Germany, but do you think that other European partners can expect Germany to move a little bit more and not be the status quo power, as you mentioned?
I'm not so sure if Germany will go ahead foremost at the level of the EU. I think at the moment, it's very much the internal debate, as was just mentioned, getting its act together and following up and implementing what Scholz announced. And then I think at the moment, the way I see it, it would actually be more in terms of strengthening NATO's pillar and Germany's contribution within NATO so as to strengthen the European pillar in NATO. At the moment, as I see it, I'm a bit more skeptical. Of course, the strategic compass was approved at the end of March and presents some concrete measures, a rapid, capacity deployment force of 5,000 men. But I think now at the moment of a hot war in Europe, I think it's more at the level of strengthening the eastern flank, where Germany has already been part in terms of the enhanced forward presence, of air policing in Romania, of contributing to the defense of Slovakia. So I think that on the one hand, I wonder to what extent European defense integration, because of the war in Ukraine, will not experience more of, even if it's not a break, at least a slowing down. Also because we're not really, the way that France looks at it, always insisting upon strategic autonomy. I think Germany-France defense cooperation hasn't worked that well in the last couple of years. Also during the previous government, we saw the defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, being very critical of Macron's pledge on Europe's strategic autonomy. So the way I see it at the moment, it can change, but I see it more as a way, this coming of age of Germany's security and defense policy could be framed within NATO. Again, I'm not sure what the willingness is vis-a-vis, for instance, the SPD. And here, just a short comment on the side. I always find it striking how it's the Greens. I thought of the Kosovo operation, and it was a Green foreign minister which led Germany to participate, or which supported it. And now again, it's the Greens, it's Annalena Baerbock, it's Anton Hofreiter, who have a much more assertive position than the SPD. And maybe just to add another point in terms of your previous question, I think now what is really important, and for me the question of German leadership is also something that I've been thinking about for a long time. Some authors, William Patterson and Simon Ballmer, talked about Germany's leadership avoidance reflex, more with regard to EU politics. It's true, but you know, we from the outside, we're sort of always waiting, and it's a bit like former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski said 2011. You know, he fears more Germany's inaction than Germany's leadership, and now is exactly the momentum that, in terms of foreign policy, Germany could pick that up, and could pick it up also at the moment where there is this willingness and this acceptance by most other players. Of course, Poland is extremely interested that Germany engages more in conventional defense, but for instance, my own country, Portugal, on the other side of the continent, you know, there is always in discourse, not in political discourse, but always in conferences and from the public, you hear very often, you hear the fear of German hegemony. So, you know, we also have some work to do. We, Germany's neighbors, also have some work to do to support Germany in going forward with this security and defense revolution. And we also have to change our discourse. But Germany has to take advantage of the momentum in when it actually does so and when it proceeds. And you know, this fear of Germany becoming the biggest military power in Europe, which is what would happen if Germany spent a 2% and invested around 70 or 75 billion euros a year in its defense, will change the balance within Europe. And so from the outside, again, this momentum is also something that we from the outside should support, and Germany shouldn't wait too long in implementing it.
Thanks, a very important point. Just to mention that you can ask your questions if you have some. I haven't seen them yet, so don't hesitate. We still have half an hour. I'd like to stay on the topic of EU defense and security policy, as you mentioned that you see it more strengthening the European pillar within NATO. Now into you, Jana. I know it's one of the topics you work on a lot. So do you think that there will be a change in EU foreign policy thanks to this change of Germany, or do you see it rather being hindered, so that the implications will be, but yes, we have a strengthened European pillar with it. Now NATO, we do work more together, or do you see that it's going to be maybe even a fragmentation, that it's going to be very national and not much cooperation, or do you see something where the EU is in the lead?
Couple of points. First, maybe let's have a look at the Sondervermögen and why it's 100 billion euros. So I think the reason is that people looked very carefully what Germany had already promised to deliver within the framework of the EU and NATO. So it's linked to big ticket items, such as the procurement of the F-35, such as making sure that FCAS continues, such as a heavy transport helicopter. So I think it's not only limited to the European pillar in NATO. I think the Germans have made, I think, pretty clear to the French after they have announced that they want to procure some F-35 that it's also about FCAS, so also very much about EU or European defense cooperation. So I think yeah, I think it's important to have this in mind. When it comes to long-term, short-term, and who benefits, for example, one of the big question now is, so we have this 100 billion Sondervermögen, and so if we go back to what I've said previously, we have basically our defense budget is right now is 50 billion. To get us to 2%, we must spend 75 billion. So that would mean that we would need to take 25 billion from the Sondervermögen, plus ideally also the 10 billion that we have earmarked for investment. And that would mean that we, as Germany, need to spend a whole lot of money in a very short time. And that leaves us with the question, how to do this. So do we buy off the shelf, like existing products, or do we invest in long-term development, maybe within an EU or European framework? And I think these are the questions. A lot of countries, especially smaller countries, are a bit worried that a lot of money will flood basically the European defense market soon, and that every nation will just buy off the shelf whatever it needs without any coordination. I've heard some ideas about, some more coordinated efforts with other Europeans. And I think this German government wouldn't rule this out. So when it comes to the political sphere, I think that the Germans, especially in the SPD, but also in the Greens, within the Greens have a huge interest in not making Germany another kind of even more the indispensable giant in Europe. So we are this big fat country already, very rich, but just to compare, if we really kind of spend the Sondervermögen and get to the 2%, we are spending far more than France and the UK. So it would really make us in total the third largest defense spender in the world. And in order for our neighbors to make this digestible, I think that the German government does have an interest to anchor this in a multilateral context. But I'm very much with Patricia. I think it will not only be an EU context, it will be very much a European pillar in NATO context, because from a German perspective, territorial defense is taken care of in NATO. And actually the transatlantic alliance and how it is perceived here in Germany has been strengthened through the war. So a lot of people here are pretty aware that without the Americans, we would not have been able to manage the crisis up until now the way we did. So I think it will boost NATO, and I think this is also Germany's, if you want, natural role. It's the role that Germany played during the Cold War. It's to be the conventional backbone in NATO. It's to be a big power where other kind of smaller powers can cooperate with. And I think this will be very much the ambition. But I think there will be certainly a German emphasis on making this digestible for our European neighbors and kind of bringing other Europeans in. And also because it's not only about Germany. I mean, I think the Zeitenwende is something that has actually spiraled. So, for example, the Danes are now thinking about opting into European defense. The Swedes and the Finns are joining NATO. So in other countries, a lot is going on. A lot of countries have already declared they will want to spend more on defense. So I think this is also a huge momentum now in Europe, where focus is on defense. And what I would wish to see is less a focus on the frameworks and kind of to think of, I don't know, NATO and the EU as silos, but really to continue what I think has already started with the 2 declarations already existing between EU and NATO. I think with the strategic compass, which is very NATO friendly, if you want, and where kind of this idea that maybe the EU is also a framework for joint development for things that can then also be used in a NATO framework. I think we have made progress here. It's less, the relationship is less toxic, and kind of the 2 institutions have moved closer together. And what I would really like to see is us Europeans, not only the EU countries, but including the UK, including Norway, to have an all hands on deck approach, because I think the situation is really serious. And that's my last point, looking at the United States, looking at the midterms later this year, but then also looking at 2024, taking into account how much the Europeans are dependent on the Americans, as we see on a daily basis now. I think we really have a limited time frame to get our act together. I think we cannot afford to think in silos. I think we need to to make the nexus between EU and NATO even stronger. And yeah, as I said, all hands on deck, less silos. Let's use the money that will be available in a more constructive and more coordinated manner. That would be my plea.
Thank you, and also thanks for mentioning that the Danes have changed, and maybe interesting that I think many also in Brussels who might not work on defense and security have discovered that the EU had a defense clause, and that suddenly the EU also, this aspect was kind of emphasized more than it was before. One point we haven't discussed yet, and I see the last question, and then great, I'll look at the question, but one more point, because we cannot talk about Zeitenwende without taking up a little bit about energy policy in Russia. So to Patricia, I know we've seen that Hungary is still having a veto against the 6th sanction package because of the oil embargo. We know that in Germany it was also a difficult discussion to see whether there would be an embargo on Russian oil and gas. Do you think, and you also already mentioned also the strategy of Wandel durch Handel, so transformations with trade, that was really part of Germany's Russia policy and also part of the China policy. Do you think that this is going to change in Germany? Can you expect, are we going to have oil and gas embargo because Germany will change its position, or do you think it's going to be, more nitty-gritty and a long-term process until we manage to have less dependence on Russian fossil fuels?
Well, it is a difficult decision. The coal embargo was relatively easy in comparison. The oil embargo has been approved by Germany. It's still, as you mentioned, Hungary is still to be convinced. But I think the important thing here is that Germany is in the process of realizing its foreign dependency. So as to say, its energy dependence from Russia, its trade dependency from China, two autocracies which do not share our values, which in the case of Russia have shown that it doesn't stick to treaties and principles that both sides have signed. And so, as Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said yesterday, I thought it was quite telling when she said, well, we have to reduce the energy dependence from Russia, bring it down to zero and forever. So if that is the course, if that is the direction, it goes in line with this change of the bilateral relationship, also in terms of energy, and reducing this energy dependence and quickly finding alternatives. I think Trade and Minister and Vice Chancellor Habeck, he was quite quick when not only with his visit to Qatar in trying to find alternatives in terms of liquefied natural gas, but also with the US and with the construction of the terminals in Brunsbüttel and Wilhelmshaven. Supposedly Wilhelmshaven, I think, is to be finished already this year. So I think there has been a speedy change. But as I say, this all is part of this recognition. So we hope that certain premises of Germany's foreign policy have to change radically. This is quite a dramatic shift. And just to finish off, if I may, just very briefly with the point vis-a-vis European and NATO. And as Jana said, they should be looked at in a cooperative way, very much so. And US and EU or NATO-EU cooperation needs to be deepened, and fortunately that has been set in motion. It was already before the invasion. But regarding the defense systems, the future of combat air system, the FCAS that was mentioned, is supposedly only ready in 2040, if at all, whereas the procurement of F-35 fighter jets in substitution of the Tornadoes, that is now. So it's on different levels. And when we discuss this, we shouldn't really put one against the other. So I think the important thing is for Germany to reduce dependency. And I think this recognition is now here.
Thanks. We do have 3 questions, so I'd like to take them directly if the people are there, and we'll start off with Alexander Moore. I don't know if you are there live. Please go ahead. I can see him join. You're still muted. Can you hear us? No, it doesn't seem to work. In that case, I'll just read the question, which I think is a fascinating question we haven't discussed yet, which is, do you think that nuclear weapons will become an option for Germany as well? The big nuclear question, which we haven't discussed yet. We have a second person, so maybe if that person wants to join, who is Dimitri Korpakis. Apologies for butchering your name. If you could quickly ask your question, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophie, for taking my question. I think that everything that has been said is very important. But on the other side, I think that we need to keep in mind that building defense capabilities on the one hand is very important, but on the other, I think we should keep in mind, keeping in mind what happened with the previous two world wars. I mean, my father fought in the Second World War, and at what we see at present, there is no real serious diplomatic effort from European powers for at least a ceasefire. I don't underestimate the fact that we have an aggression that we cannot really discuss calmly with an aggressor, but there are ways in which you can always discuss. So at present, what we see is only some kind of initiatives from non-European countries. So my question is, do we really need to leave this to non-Europeans, or we could take also an initiative in this sense? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Although I have to say that Macron is on the phone quite a lot with Putin, but maybe you can comment on that. And the last question is from Leo Klein. So if you want to join and ask your question, please go ahead. Can you hear us? He says he's in a noisy environment. I'm sorry about this. This is always the perks of the online comments. In that case, I'll read the question, which is linked to the discussion on energy security that we just had. How far does the Zeitenwende include a broadening of the security agenda in Germany? And is there a big debate to be had on what counts as investing in security? I think also an extremely interesting question. So whoever wants to start, please go ahead. I think we have super interesting questions on nuclear, on the diplomacy, and also then on the energy security. Maybe Jana, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I take the last point first, because I think this is very interesting and very timely. So because when the government came into office, they gave themselves a coalition treaty. And in the coalition treaty, they have a comprehensive understanding of security. In German, they call it umfassender Sicherheitsbegriff. I would translate this as all-encompassing understanding of security, or comprehensive, all-encompassing. So, and the Greens especially made it a point that security is more than just the military sphere. It's about climate change very much. It's about feminist foreign policy. It's about of course hybrid and cyber, but it's the concept of human security is also very much front and center. And so this was the starting point. And now we see kind of the return of kind of the classical military kind of security threats, which in the coalition treaty, I think were of course reflected, but not to that degree. And so it's not only about how to use the Sondervermögen. I think for the Greens, it's really now a worry that the focus is too much on the military realm and not enough on other aspects. And so I think the government wants to make sure that they have a broader approach. And where you see this reflected, I hope, and I think, is now in the new national security strategy that Germany is currently writing, that the German government is currently writing. The pen holder is the Federal Foreign Office, with other offices, with other ministries coming in. And there, the ambitious task really is, what do we understand by comprehensive security, all-encompassing security, while there is a major conventional, luckily so far, conventional war in Europe ongoing, and how to find the right balance, I think will be crucial. But as I said, there is very much the awareness that security is more than nuclear weapons or tanks. Coming to the nuclear question, which is, I think, also quite easy to answer because I think this is the very last thing that the German government would want to do. But of course, it's a looming question in the background. I think it is less debated. There were some articles in recent years since Donald Trump got elected, and people have started to think about our dependence on American nuclear weapons. I can remember, I don't know, 2 or 3 op-eds and people calling for German nuclear weapons, but they are really outliers in the German debate, like really, really big outliers. I think there is no appetite whatsoever to have a German bomb. What people have started to talk about quite reluctantly is kind of whether it was a mistake in 2020 when President Macron offered the Germans to talk about the role that French nuclear weapons could play, not sharing the button, not providing any sort of co-ownership or whatever, nuclear sharing, but just a debate where the Germans have been super reluctant. Whether this should be revived. But overall, I think it's really, and also the F-35 decision that basically makes German participation in the NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement sustainable again, is a commitment to NATO and to organize this within NATO, and that means with the Americans playing the kind of front and center role. Lastly, I think this is the most difficult question. Negotiations, Germany, hear people talking about a ceasefire or a face-saving compromise, and how I see it is that I think so. The Ukrainian government early on, I think, offered a constructive conversation on this matter. They offered to take the contact line of the 23rd of February as a starting position. They offered to have a long-term conversation, like 15-year framework about Crimea. They said they could live without applying for NATO membership if they get security guarantees. But then Bucha happened and the atrocities and Mariupol, and I think it became increasingly hard for the Ukrainian government also to communicate to their citizens what could be conditions for negotiations. And I don't see, especially from the Russian side, I don't see any attempt to change course, to change gear. I mean, as we speak now, Kherson is getting annexed, basically, or they kind of they without even a referendum, they declare they want to include it. The ruble is official payment system in some parts already. So I think while we discuss this, they make facts on the ground, the Russians. And so how I see it is that I think we could support the Ukrainian government. We do that, but I think it's very important what also Olaf Scholz says all the time. So it cannot be about imposing anything on the Ukrainian government. It is a democratic government. Zelensky is elected. The Ukrainian civil society is on board with what the government does, and we need to leave it also in Ukrainian hands. And I think there is every readiness to facilitate conversations, but I don't see how this could end, because I don't see Russia making any concessions, and increasingly I don't see Ukraine making any concessions either. And it leaves me also a bit speechless, but I think I can totally understand that for the Ukrainians, a ceasefire would mean a possibility for the Russians to get new strength and to just prepare the next offensive. And so for Ukraine, I think it's not about war and peace, it's about war with Russia or kind of Russian occupation with all the atrocities committed. It's about a life that they just don't want to live, which I can perfectly understand.
Thanks for making the point. goes a little bit off the Zeitenwende debate, but an important point to make about the diplomatic response and how that fits in the military. Patricia, a few last comments. I'm looking a little bit at the watch, so if you have anything to add to the 3 questions that were asked.
Yes, maybe very briefly regarding the first one on the nuclear weapons. I think Jana has already mentioned it. There is this big reluctance in Germany, of course, and it was part also of the unification agreement. But it's true that in the last few years it has come up by only a few, and I think it's a point to keep in mind. I don't believe it's at the moment on the table, and I think maybe the best reason why it's not on the table is because the coalition agreement did recognize and agree to the nuclear sharing agreement. So sort of that in itself responded to it. On the energy security, I think security in Germany has always been the most encompassing, and now it's sort of stepping up to the level of defense, and these are obviously interlinked, but I think now the debate will be, on the one hand, the defense and strengthening Germany as a defense actor, while at the same time not sort of secondarizing other important elements of security. And here, green security and a more comprehensive security from the German part will always be a sort of promoted, because that's very much in the DNA of Germany's foreign policy. And lastly, regarding diplomacy, I think it's a very fair question, and it's an important question to try to find a solution in this horrible, unprecedented situation. But I think Europe has actually delivered and has created facts by imposing 5 packages of sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, by providing humanitarian assistance, by taking up more than 5 million Ukrainian refugees outside of Ukraine itself, and providing assistance inside and delivering them weapons. But at the end of the day, if there's not the willingness from the part of who started this aggression, and we've had the mediation attempts in Turkey, it's very difficult that Europe can be some sort of diplomatic actor, also because lastly, European member states, the EU itself, but also European member states and NATO member states, of course, they're not part of the conflict as such. They're not war parties, but they're very much involved. So on the other side, Russia would not accept it. But the fact is, and I'll finish here, that this European security order has collapsed. We definitely need to start thinking of building the new security order, which would start with solving the conflict in Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, the overall security order. And here, and I would just finish on this point, I think we still nevertheless aware, at least here where I said that the US and even the UK are still very much needed and part of this reconstruction of the European security order in the medium and long term.
Thank you so much, Patricia. You did such a good final word that I won't have to ask you like the final statements, because it's already done. So we will finish 2 minutes early, which is great, because normally events always go a little bit too long. Thank you so much for giving your insights. I think that was a fascinating debate for me as a non-defense expert, but someone who's very interested, of course, in what is currently happening and following German EU policy quite a lot. Thank you to the participants for listening in, despite, offline events taking back. I think we still are doing online events, just to mention this, to make sure that we can have this discussion when someone is sitting in Berlin and in Lisbon and in Brussels. And I think that's also the advantage of still doing online events, to be able to have those cross-border conversations that don't require necessarily to fly in, and which is not great for the environment. On that note, thanks so much. We will have more events coming up on the Zeitenwende. I'm looking forward to also reading from both speakers the next op-eds and discussion papers. I'm sure that will come out on that topic. And I wish you all a wonderful, is it Wednesday? is it Wednesday evening, afternoon? Oh God, it's already in the middle of the week.
No, only the middle of the week.
I can feel it. All right.
Thank you. Thanks for moderating. Bye-bye.